Lando Norris absolutely put himself in the favored position for the World Drivers' Championship today. And I actually think that this championship is going to make things really interesting when we talk about sprint races as a whole. Sprint races in general have been a very contentious subject since the format was introduced. When we have a sprint race weekend, we lose 2 practice sessions, which means that drivers and teams have a lot less time to figure out the track. If you're new to the world of Cargo Fast, on a normal Grand Prix weekend, we have 3 free practice sessions. On a sprint race weekend, sprint qualifying and the sprint race replace free practice 2 and free practice 3, meaning that every driver only has a single hour on the track to get all of that information and to get comfortable. And of course, if it ends up being the first time you've ever raced at this track, especially with how many rookies we have in the field this year, this could mean that you end up with a single hour on this track before things start to really count. And sprint races have also been a contentious subject amongst the drivers, specifically with Max, because of the idea that it makes things less exciting for the Grand Prix. And of course, today we saw one of the biggest negatives of a sprint race format, and that was Gabriel Bortoletta's crash. Because Gabriel had a very intense crash in the sprint race itself, and because of how little time we have between the sprint race and the qualifying session for the Grand Prix, at Gabriel Bortoletta's home race, he wasn't able to actually get on track in time for qualifying. So there's obviously a lot of different pros and cons when it comes to the sprint race. It makes weekends tougher and tighter, and it can affect a driver's outcome for the Grand Prix itself if something goes wrong in the sprint race. However, the other thing that it does is it puts extra points on the table, and we're seeing that become a really big factor in this year's championship run. Lando Norris came into this race weekend with a single point between himself and his teammate, and with the outcome of the sprint race with his teammate and closest competitor crashing, Lando's able to pick up an additional 8 points that wouldn't be on the table if we didn't have sprint races. And of course, Max is also able to pick up a couple of extra points when it comes to cutting into that gap with Oscar. And the sprint races have been a big factor of why we've even talked about Max being able to still potentially win this championship. The extra points, while they may seem minimal, do have the possibility of making a big difference when it comes to a close championship race. And another example of this is the fact that we saw both McLarens DNF during the US sprint race. That gave Max a chance to get extra points on the board and cut into that gap, making this a closer title fight as we continue through the weekends. However, after today's sprint race, Lando obviously ends up being the biggest beneficiary of those extra points. And depending on how tomorrow goes, Lando may actually be able to start to close the door on this championship earlier than we thought. Though of course, we should never say never when it comes to Brazil, because even though Max will be starting the race from P16, we know that last year he started in P17 and won the race by nearly 20 seconds. But the real question is, can Max Verstappen pull a Max Verstappen tomorrow? Or can Oscar show up strong and prove that he still has his head in the game? For you, out of these 3 drivers, which one do you think is taking home the World Drivers' Championship? And do you think Lando Norris might be able to seal everyone's fate tomorrow when the lights go out?